Natural Resources Committee meeting today. I'm going to call this meeting to order. We have just one item in committee today, and it is the 1913 Wild and Exotic Animals. Ms. Hayward is going to take it away in a minute, but we're going to, quick rundown, we're going to listen to staff's presentation. Then we have a few expert panelists we're going to hear from, and then we're going to open it up for public comment. I'm hoping that council, we can ask questions at the end of each presentation. So if you'll just kind of hold until staff and then our experts get through, I think that'd be helpful in keeping us as much on time today as we can. It's going to be a little bit longer of a meeting. I don't think we'll end right at 5. So with that, Ms. Hayward.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. And actually, Colin, I don't believe that I've got a share function ready. So if you can maybe give me permission. So as that change is made to the meeting, I will just start with a brief introduction. Oh, there we go. I'm Tansy Hayward, Deputy City Manager. We do have a PowerPoint presentation that that you now have seen come up on your screen. I'm going to be giving the entirety of the presentation today just for efficiency, given time we want to reserve for the panelists and for the public comment. But I do want to recognize a number of city staff that are available if there are additional questions, if there are as we get into the tail end of the presentation. So Deputy Chief Scott Osterhout is available today. We also have Captain Diedrich Bond on the call. David Fitzgerald, who is our Revenue Services Manager in our Finance Department, is on the call if there are questions for him. Robin Tatum, City Attorney, is on, as well as Alice Tejada. So Alice is a senior attorney in the City Attorney's Office who works with the Police Department. I do also want to recognize that we do have Brad Howard, who is with the Wildlife Commission. So there will be some slides in my presentation that he may speak to in greater detail when we get to the panel. And I also want to recognize just briefly Dr. Jennifer Federico with Wake County Animal Control that was really helpful in providing some content for this presentation as well. So you've already heard a little bit of this brief rundown of the agenda today from the chair. So we do have some information just giving some broad overview of the systems as they exist today. We did do some peer benchmarking. Some of this members of the council saw previously in terms of research that the City Attorney's Office did on ordinances, particularly around the state. We did do some broader benchmarking to understand some operational practices. And then again, do want to recognize and thank those expert panelists that have joined us today outside of their demanding other professional schedules to provide their information or unique perspectives on this topic. So I'm going to start really briefly just with a bird's eye view of Raleigh's animal control functions within the city. So currently we have 10 animal control officers that are assigned to the unit. They are with one supervisor. You'll see here that there is a very high level of calls for service that this unit is tasked to respond to. So I'll go into greater detail on following slides so that you get a sense of where the emphasis of their enforcement activities are currently. So here you can see that by far there is a lot of focus on stray animals, and then some broader categories just in terms of broad requests, and then the other discrete item with a high call volume is sick and injured animals. You can see a lot of increases in the workload across the board here in terms of stray animals, and other services, as well as a significant number of responses to animal bites. So the animal control officers are empowered under state law to investigate animal cruelty and have taken action. There are specific procedures called out in our city code with regard to dangerous animals in terms of the procedures that we follow and the remedies. And so they do address that. And they also coordinate with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission to address wildlife, non-domesticated animal issues when those arise. So just a brief snapshot of the municipal code. So our provisions in our municipal code currently are included in Chapter 3 of the municipal code. There is specific guidance related to the care of dogs, cats, cattle, fowl, goats, domesticated, some information around domesticated wild animals, and then also information about pet stores. There is definition in pretty great detail around dangerous dogs and the processes to address, as I spoke to on the prior slide. There are definitions for nuisance animals in a subset, which is considered a vicious animal. Both of those proceedings are really on the basis of activities or impacts that have been experienced by those animals. They aren't proactive provisions. And in the code today, there is no specific language that addresses exotic animals or reptiles and amphibians. So in terms of around the state, there are some cities, and cities are empowered to put in place licensing or registration provisions should they wish to. Currently, the city of Raleigh does not have a regulatory license or registration for any kind of animal registration, including exotic or reptiles, amphibians. You'll see that the provisions where we do have regulatory licenses are taxi permits. So the finance office receives those permits, but there is as you can see, in terms of focused enforcement system, there is a staff within the police department that does do annual inspections and reviews those applications. So there is a bit more of a proactive enforcement implementation of that program. Amplified entertainment permit, I think the city council has had some recent conversations about this permit in the past. That has been more of a passive registration through the finance department. There has been more recent work in collaboration with the police department and emergency management special events to address issues of concerns related to amplified entertainment, and that's under review in terms of moving to more proactive enforcement of those provisions going forward. And the last regulatory license is the pawnbroker license, which again is more of a reactive enforcement strategy if there are issues that are raised of concern for follow-up. So Wake County, I think as the council is aware, the city can work with the county to opt in to provisions in county ordinance. That Wake County's animal control provisions are found in Chapter 91 of their code. There are municipalities within the county that have opted into that. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see the cities that have their independent animal control functions. That includes us, Cary, Garner, and Holly Springs. They have a lot of similar provisions in the county code to the city code. So speaking to the care of animals and cruelty of animals, there is also language in their code similar to the city of Raleigh's regarding dangerous dogs and the processes to address. They do have a number of provisions that address rabies and intervention or responsibilities related to the prevention of rabies. Two things that are three provisions that are unique in the county ordinance is one, that provision related to inherently dangerous mammals. So that is language that is a little bit different than in our code and does include some prohibitions for things like big cats or hybrid kinds of dogs, wolves, could include primates, those kinds of things. That the county does sometimes get concerns or interact with citizens around some of those particularly large cats in speaking with Wake County Animal Control. The other two provisions that are beyond the kinds of provisions we find in the City of Raleigh ordinance is there is language around a community cat initiative that is related to the trap, neuter, return program within the county. So those provisions do allow community organizations to capture feral cats, to address the spay or neuter needs of those animals and to release them. Similarly, the community cat kind of colonies can register with the county and be recognized, and the cats under the care of that initiative will not be collected through county animal control activities, knowing that they are being cared for through that program. So those are unique to the city's program. There's a lot of provisions in state law that relate to animals. And so those are sprinkled throughout multiple chapters of state law. I've underlined a few regulations that I'll go into in greater detail in this presentation, but in chapter 14, there are a number of provisions, things like cruelty to animals, protection of livestock, regulation of certain reptiles, and I'll address those provisions on a following slide. In chapter 19A, again, a broad set of provisions related to animal welfare, cruelty, spay neuter programs, and then some operational outline of operational kind of programs and funding support. In chapter 113, it outlines the powers and duties of the Wildlife Resource Commission. And again, you'll be hearing from Mr. Howard later about the duties and responsibilities. I will briefly speak to a couple of the permits. There are a broad set of licenses and permits that the Wildlife Resource Commission is responsible for. There are a couple that are more pertinent to some of the conversations that the City Council has had specifically related to exotic animals. Chapter 138, again, provides a lot of direction and provisions around the prevention and actions related to rabies. And then in chapter 160A, which provides a lot of the local authority to cities, there is specific language around the authority of cities and towns to put in place additional regulations regarding animals beyond that provided in state law. So again, I said that I would go into a little bit greater detail in terms of the statutes in chapter 14 related to venomous reptiles and amphibians. So these are provisions in the past when the city does have authority. You see under 14.419 for our local animal control officers to be able to take enforcement action based on this statute. And so a recent enforcement case that everybody's familiar here with in Raleigh, these were the statutes that we utilized in that case, including the last, which is gives us the ability to charge and receive restitution, which were pursued in the recent case in North Raleigh. There are a couple of permits that the Wildlife Resources Commission keeps relevant to this discussion. The first is individuals that have large volumes of amphibians or reptiles are required to get permits through the Wildlife Resources Commission. You'll see on the second bullet that reinforces that individuals may not keep wildlife as pets, but that there are some narrow circumstances where it is permitted to keep a wild animal in captivity. So those are things, scientific, educational, exhibition, or similar kinds of purposes. So again, very clear that the state does not permit those animals to be kept as pets, but there is a licensing process for those permitted activities. And then again, this is the provision in state law, which gives local cities and towns the ability to regulate animal activities within their jurisdictions. So the city attorney's office, previously with the help of an intern, did do some online research to quickly assess the state of play kind of across the city with regard to ordinance, local ordinance language. You'll see in this table a number of city jurisdictions. The focus here is specifically on exotic reptiles and amphibians, whether there are provisions in these ordinances that address reptiles and amphibians specifically. You'll see a number of cities that have provisions in their ordinances, a number of counties. It is worth noting there are cities such as Fayetteville that rely on Cumberland County, so they have opted into a county ordinance rather than creating a local city ordinance. And then you can see a list of cities that have no provisions. This slide has been modified from information that the council would have previously seen in other information, adding Des Moines, Iowa, Arlington, Virginia, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Virginia Beach, Virginia. That was more recent benchmarking that was done in preparation for this meeting. So again, speaking to that research that was done, we did send out a survey to 21 state and national peers that were of more similar size in terms of more urban cities. We unfortunately only had 5 cities respond to that survey. The cities that responded included, again, Fort Lauderdale, Virginia Beach, Cumberland County responded on behalf of Fayetteville, and then Des Moines, Iowa, and Arlington, Virginia. So the focus of the survey was, again, try to understand for those cities beyond the original benchmarking within the state, those communities that had local regulations related to exotic animals, to understand what kind of programming was in place in terms of proactive implementation of that. So there's another slide that's upcoming that will show the options that we asked to try to understand what level of programming was in place. And then we also tried to understand how peer cities are leveraging partner organizations in implementing their programs. So this is a detailed slide. Again, this will give you a point of reference in terms of the populations that each of the organizations shared to give some point of reference, the number of animal control or related functions. In some of these cases, these are contracted entities or partnerships, not internal animal control functions. Again, for a point of reference reminder, the city of Raleigh has 10 animal control officers and 1 supervisor. So across the board here, some of the staffing capacity in some of these peer cities is a bit more robust. It's hard for us to know without a lot of detailed work if there are deeper programmatic differences that would explain those differences. You'll see again, Cumberland County, which was already represented, did have provisions in its ordinance related to exotic animals. You'll see of the other 4 that were added as a result of this benchmarking. 2 did have local provisions in their ordinances and 2 did not. You'll see on the slide in the last column that question about whether there is some level of programming in place around their provisions related to exotic animals. And you'll see that information on the following slide. So the things that we tried to ascertain, whether organizations had put in place, is whether they had any kind of registration to understand the exotic animals or reptiles and amphibians in their communities. We didn't identify in this subset any organizations that had taken that. And none had dedicated staffing for this purpose. Again, none appeared to be keeping broad training related to exotic animals. There were 2 organizations that reported that they did have certifications or training related to the handling of reptiles and amphibians. None were doing any kind of proactive outreach or education related to their exotic animal regulations or standards. And none seem to have standing on-call kind of relationships in place to address a concern related to an exotic animal when it came in. It did appear through the information that every organization that responded did rely on some level of partnership with outside agencies for technical or operational support. That included their county animal control functions, the equivalent state departmental resources here in North Carolina, state zoos or aquariums, animal rescue groups, and then animal control organizations. So there were regionally some differences in which animal control organizations were called out. But the organizations like the Humane Society or the ASPCA. So at this point, I can pause if there are questions for me or any of the other staff that are on the call before we invite our expert panel to the screen.
That'd be great. Council members, I can see you, but if we could also take down the screen share just for a second. Does anybody have any questions? Got Councilmember Cox first and then Councilmember Knight.
Yes, I was wondering with the other communities in North Carolina, how their ordinances complement or supplement what's at the state level.
Yeah, so I will defer a little bit to Robin and to Alice potentially. So I think they have a broad sense of scanning those ordinances, but I think they would be better able to represent some of what they saw in those ordinances across the state.
Well, I can start and then I'll let Alice chime in. We had previously provided this chart to council where we did just a survey of some cities and counties in North Carolina who regulate exotic and dangerous reptiles was what the research we did. We found that there are a number of cities and counties that do specifically call them out as being prohibited. I think that what happened was when the city manager's office did their survey and reached out to find out how they worked and if they were enforcing them, that basically no one responded other than Cumberland County. So they're in the ordinances. They basically, most of them prohibit it. A couple have a registration process, but basically they're on paper and we weren't able to get any answers about what they're doing on the ground. As far as the state, if there's anything with respect to the state, I would just let Alice get on the line wherever she is and talk about that real quickly.
I think I would defer if there's an expert from the Wildlife Commission. They can speak probably more eloquently about what the regulation is, but they do have a permitting process for certain wildlife. And I think there was a slide that presented about how you can have 5 types of amphibians or reptiles based on their category. If they have up to 5, they're going to require a permit. If they have up to 25, they're going to require a different permit. So essentially, the state regulates through the Wildlife Commission, and they regulate through licensing and permitting, is my understanding. But I think the Wildlife Commission representative can probably speak with more detail about their enforcement and regulation.
Okay, so the one question I have regarding state law is when does when would a city ordinance come into conflict with state law, and can we actually enact an ordinance that is more restrictive than state law?
If you want me to take that, Robin, I can.
Yeah, you can take it or I can take it. And just, I guess we refer them to 168, 187.
Yes. So,
You go ahead.
so there is a statute 168, I think you know, it regulates cities and municipalities as to what laws they can enforce, pass, regulate. And 168-187 is possession or harboring of dangerous animals, ordinance to regulate, restrict, or prohibit the possession or harboring within the city of animals which are dangerous to persons or property. The only limitation is that we cannot be less prohibitive than the state. So we have to follow, at the very least, what the state does in terms of setting prohibitions. So if we are less restrictive on our regulations, that would be in violation of state law, but we are certainly allowed to be more restrictive.
Okay, thank you.
It is worth noting, because I went through the slide on North Carolina state statutes pretty quickly, and Mr. Howard may be able to speak to this. In Chapter 113, there is a lot of definition in defining animal categories and species types. So that's certainly something I think we want to be aware of in alignment or classification in any ordinance that we were to create.
Thank you. And Councilmember Knight, you had a question?
Yes, just real quick. Thank you. I just will hope that the experts respond to Ms. Haywood's presentation. They may be able to discuss it or comment on it a little bit better than us, but that would be helpful if they have any specific thoughts on it. Thank you.
Ms. Hayward, I'll let you introduce our panelists because I think you know what order.
Yes, thank you. First, and I believe I can see him on the screen, although we've not had the privilege to meet except via email. I believe Brad Howard, the Wildlife Division Chief with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, is going to kick us off.
Okay, is all my computer stuff working? Can everybody
We can
hear?
hear you.
Excellent. So there were a number of different questions there. So I was trying to jot them down. The purpose of the Wildlife Resource Commission is the regulatory authority over native wildlife species in the state, and we regulate all native wildlife from take of native wildlife to holding those animals in captivity to rehabilitation permits. We do not issue and authorize captivity of native wildlife simply as pets. As I just want to have a pet deer. I want to have a pet cottontail rabbit. Can't get a captivity permit for that. You have to be, it has to be bona fide educational, scientific permits, those kind of things. So in general, the holding of native wildlife anywhere in the state, be it inside the city, a county, or whatever, is fairly highly regulated as we speak in terms of just basically having just native animals in captivity. It's not legal. You can't do it. You referenced the 113 statutory definitions, which there's like 4 pages of different kind of definitions identifying what the different species are. There's upland game birds. There's, it really defines everything. We also have definitions in NCAC and our 10H1401, it's our general definitions and requirements for captivity licenses, and it's actually quite a big rule. I mean, and you can go look at it. But it has a whole host of definitions. That this whole premise is aimed at basically making sure that people, if they are holding native wildlife species in captivity, it is for a bona fide reason. It's a scientific reason. It's an educational purpose. Those types of things. We don't prohibit holding them as pets for breeding purposes, for dog training. None of that. There's only certain reasons you can hold native wildlife species in captivity. With one exception, and this is the one that hits rather close to home. The possession of reptiles and amphibians. We have a rule, and this is there's a long history behind this rule, and there's lots of people. I know people find this hard to believe, or maybe not with recent activities, but there are people who really like herps. They really like reptiles. They really like amphibians. They collect them. They hold them. We have a provision in rule that says that you can collect and hold up to 4 native reptile species unless they're listed. So just to go ahead and cut to the chase. So technically a person could hold 4 cottonmouth snakes or copperhead snakes. They cannot hold rattlesnakes without a dangerous species license from us, permit from us. And they would have to have a bona fide reason for doing it. But if somebody wanted to have wanted to hold 4 copperheads, according to the state law, they could do that. And there are a few people. We do not regulate any exotic species whatsoever. So the cobra, all that stuff really doesn't fall inside of our jurisdiction. There's some Article 55 stuff. I don't know if you touched on Article 55 and the holding of dangerous reptiles and that kind of thing. But actually we don't regulate the exotic species. But those are the only real exceptions of people, quote unquote, and the honest reason for that is because people, kids they get a pet frog, they pick up a turtle, which we don't encourage them to do that, but lots of people have box turtles, a box turtle pet or whatever. So we have the provision. Now, anybody that collects or holds more reptiles or amphibians than that must have a collection license for scientific purposes, and you can't just as with the captivity license, you can't just get a you can't just get a collection. I want to have 50 snakes. No, there has to be a reason why you're holding that many native species. And we're actually modifying this rule to limit it. Instead of per individual, we're going to make it per physical address. So it wouldn't be legal to hold any more than 4 of a native wildlife reptile species per physical address. Right now, 3 people live there. They could each have 4 if they wanted to. So that's really, to my knowledge, the only sort of exception to the captivity rules, and it falls into the reptiles and amphibians category. Everything else is fairly highly regulated through our regulated activities. Did I touch all the questions? I can't remember, because there was one more thing I was going to comment, but I wanted to make sure I touched all the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Councilmember Cox, do you have a question?
Yes, just to be clear, when you say exotic animals, are we talking about non-native animals, or are there native animals that are considered exotic?
When I say exotic, I'm talking about non-native species.
Okay.
I'm talking about species, and my, it's kind of modern technology. I love it. My state herpetologist is listening to us as well, and he's texting me now, Jeff Hall, to make sure that I distinguish between wildlife and herps. So they're not categorized the same in wildlife. There's wild, all those definitions that I forget. I'm sorry, I don't remember who spoke. I think Ms. Hayward. Wildlife has a definition. Wild animals has a definition. Wildlife resources has a definition. But herps are not. They don't get captured under wild animals. They're not considered wild animals in state statute. So they have their own, they have their own special sort of classification. And if I didn't get that right, Jeff will text me again and tell me to fix it. But I think that's pretty much what he was meaning for me to say. It's kind of funny. I think back in the day when they established these statutes and they wrote these laws and probably even established our agency, nobody really cared about herps and reptiles, and so they just didn't even consider them wild animals. They considered mammals and birds and all of that, but they just never put the alligators aren't even considered wildlife in the statute. They're herps. They're a different category. So I think that was a good point. I kind of sort of glassed over that a little bit. That's sort of the reason for why the reptiles and amphibians are a little bit different than the other native wildlife species. Yes, sir. Or I guess I can recognize you.
Oh, that's okay. I'll just ask one more quick question. I mean, would it be legal for someone to own 4 alligators?
No,
Okay.
because alligators are listed species. Were they not a listed species, then technically, yes, it would be. But alligators are listed species. So you can get a license. We do have a few licensed facilities in the state. But honestly, most of the alligators in captivity are alligators that were born and raised in captivity. I mean, Florida, Louisiana, a lot of these states have pretty significant captive alligators. But we do have a couple that and they're for educational purposes. That the reason they hold it. We only issue those permits for educational purposes as well. Nobody has now. People probably have alligators as pets. We just hadn't caught them yet. But we do catch them periodically. Our enforcement guys are pretty good at that. If I may just make one note, I read some of the earlier versions and looking at trying to, and I commend you for trying to address this situation. It's putting some parameters on some of this stuff is always a good thing. But I've heard it referenced today a couple of times, and I saw it before referencing, what is a dangerous animal? And I think I don't want some of our native species to get labeled as quote unquote dangerous animals when a lot of them are walking around in our yards and inside the city right now, and I don't think they're dangerous. I think we can probably put our fingers on what would be considered, dangerous or inappropriate to have, and that would put people at undue risk. But so I think that's something to think about as if you explore this further is to, rather than caveat the whole group as dangerous animals, nobody should hold wildlife, and any wild animal, if handled inappropriately, is going to be, they're going to bite you or kick you or hurt you. That's what wild animals do. But that was one of the things that sort of came out. I don't want deer and foxes, and I don't want them labeled as dangerous. They are dangerous if you got them pinned up and you're trying to treat them as pets, but they also walk around in our yards quite frequently all over Raleigh. So, other questions for me? I don't know if I covered what you were hoping that I would or not.
Mr. Howard, I think that was wonderful, and I love the energy you brought to this conversation. So thank you for that. Do any council members have any final questions for Councilmember Knight? Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. And I think this is a great, I'm glad you started because I think it helps us clean up our animal list. And I've been working with the legal staff and it was just good for you to be here to confirm the issue of no native wildlife can be held in captivity. I would like us to think about if it would be smart to prohibit cottonmouths and copperheads within the city limits of Raleigh, just like we are looking at other venomous snakes. That's the only 2 that I see as native that I would be interested in prohibiting. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Mr. Howard. Ms. Hayward, I think we'll go to number 2.
Yeah, so we next have Lisa Wathney. Lisa is the senior strategist that is responsible for captive wildlife with the Humane Society of the United States. I'm going to ask that she be elevated as a panelist, just so you can see her briefly. She does have a presentation that I'm going to share that she'll give me prompts in terms of advancing slides. So just want to confirm that we've got Ms. Wathney with us.
Yes, I am here. And can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. Thank you for
Okay.
being with us.
Now you see me.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring up her presentation.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Tansy. And good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Lisa Watney, and I work on captive wildlife issues for the Humane Society of the United States. On behalf of our supporters in North Carolina and including Raleigh, we wholeheartedly support the proposal to prohibit possession of dangerous wild animals. Next slide, please. The private possession of wild species is inhumane, and it poses unacceptable risk of physical harm and disease to the community and to emergency responders. There are exotic animals in every nook and cranny of the country. Exotic cats, bears, monkeys, reptiles, and many other species are tucked away in people's basements, backyards, garages, RVs, you name it, and we have probably seen it. Next question, please. Next slide. No federal agency tracks these animals, and state and local laws vary widely. So more often than not, officials and neighbors are unaware of the presence of a dangerous wild animal until it escapes or attacks someone, as Raleigh recently experienced firsthand. Law enforcement personnel and other first responders should never have to face something as extraordinary as an escaped wild animal, and no citizen should have to worry about encountering a cobra, a wildcat, a monkey, or a python in their neighborhood. Next slide, please. The common sense solution is strict laws that limit the possession of dangerous wild animals to only qualified facilities, such as zoos accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, as well as legitimate sanctuaries. These are facilities with the knowledge, experience, and resources to provide proper, humane, safe, and long-term care for species that have unique and often very complex needs. Next slide. Dangerous wild animal generally refers to any non-domesticated species that's capable of inflicting death, serious injury, or illness to a person or domestic animal. We encourage legislators to, at the very least, ban exotic cats, bears, primates, wolves, venomous reptiles, giant constrictor snakes, alligators, and crocodiles. Next slide. Since 1990, captive big cats have killed 24 people, including one adult and one child in North Carolina. And they've injured more than 300 others in 46 states. Even the smallest monkey species are incredibly strong, and primates become especially dangerous when they reach sexual maturity. Attacks from primates can result in severe disability and disfigurement, and primates can transmit a number of very serious diseases to people, such as tuberculosis and the herpes B virus, which, if it's left untreated, has a nearly 80% mortality rate in humans. Next slide. 18 people have died from large constrictor snake-related incidents in the US since 1978. These included one person who suffered a heart attack during a violent struggle with his python, and a woman who died from a salmonella infection. 4 babies sleeping in their cribs, as well as 3 other children, have been squeezed to death by large constrictor snakes. Next slide. If someone is bitten by a venomous snake, the antivenom may be difficult to find if it exists at all. When the owner of the missing cobra was bitten by his pet mamba 3 months earlier, the antivenom had to be obtained from the Riverbanks Zoo, 250 miles away in South Carolina. This means that zoo workers are put at risk if a zoo's supply of antivenom is depleted to save the life of someone bitten by a pet. Next slide. The private possession of wild animals not only poses a danger, it sentences animals to a lifetime of misery. More often than not, these animals are kept in woefully inadequate and unnatural conditions in environments that allow no opportunity for them to express natural behaviors. Next slide. The average person simply does not have the expertise and the resources that are necessary to provide the specialized and costly care that wild species require. And as a result, these animals are typically relegated to small and barren cages and fed inappropriate diets that often result in severe health issues. And reptiles especially suffer on an unimaginable scale. Dealers typically peddle reptiles as low-maintenance pets to unqualified people at flea markets, expos, and over the internet. And most reptiles end up in homes and are not provided the space, diet, and climate-controlled environment they require. And as a result, many suffer symptoms of neglect or die due to poor care. Next slide. And especially concerning are reptile breeding operations, where the animals, who are considered nothing more than commodities, are kept in warehouse-type conditions, often stacked in plastic containers that are no bigger than a shoe or sweater box. These animals suffer significant stress and frustration in these sensory-deprived environments. And it's important to point out that no federal agency oversees reptile breeding operations. The last slide, please. We discourage laws that simply issue permits for people to keep exotic animals. Permitting systems are costly, they're labor intensive, and they're ineffective. For example, although Florida has quite a complex permitting system, it also has the worst record of dangerous incidents in the country. The only situation that warrants a permitting system is for animals covered under a grandfather clause. So prohibiting ownership of dangerous wild animals is a common sense proposal that's in the best interest of the public and the animals. And we appreciate you looking into this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wathme. Council members have any questions? Councilmember Knight.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Ms. Wathney. I want to focus on, and I appreciate your presentation. I think there's two separate but related issues. There's one in the inherently dangerous category of animals, right? And then there's the sort of the second category, which is more of the ethical issue of harboring or possessing certain of these animals. I think if I understand it right, I want you to state it again. Y'all support grandfathering all of these animals that you've talked about. It seems to me I'm not at least initially supportive of grandfathering in big cats, primates, animals like that. I am interested in having this further discussion around reptiles and amphibians, or really venomous snakes, about those, because I do think we're not at this point looking at non-dangerous reptiles and amphibians. And I know y'all want us to, and I'm glad to have that conversation, but I think the focus is more on those reptiles that are dangerous, inherently dangerous, venomous snakes, put it that way. But I want to make sure for you to say one more time, if you support grandfathering in non-reptile and amphibian classification of animals.
We do support that. That doesn't mean that we would not support an ordinance that did not have a grandfather clause. But to be honest with you, I only know of one situation where, actually maybe two, where an ordinance was passed that did not contain a grandfather clause for a number of reasons. One of them being that the local officials did not want to be responsible for having to confiscate and or place exotic animals. So the idea was anybody who already has any of these animals gets to keep them. They register them so the county or city knows what they have, and through attrition, they'll be gone.
Follow up. Councilmember Knight? Did you freeze on us?
If grandfathering was allowed, then there would have to be a registering or permitting system put in place for those grandfathered creatures, which seems to me could be quite arduous for a city staff to have to do. But I want to hear more about that.
Again, just from our experience with mostly legislation at the state level, that hasn't been a huge issue. People who want to keep their animals are given a certain amount of time to come forward, to say what they have, to register them, to identify them. And that's the only way that authorities can ensure that they don't get more, and that once those animals have passed on, no more are allowed. But that hasn't been a significant issue in other places that I know of.
Thank you, Ms. Watney.
But that would mean that animal control and other.
Councilmember Knight, I think you broke up quite a bit on that last question.
Okay, sorry, Mayor Pro Tem. Just real quick, so that would mean that our animal control would have to be prepared if we got registration back that there were these animals out there. And again, I'm not talking about the reptiles and amphibians. I'm talking about the big cats and the primates. They would have to be trained to be able to deal with these, because we know that they're out there. And even though we have them registered, and they hopefully will be examining where they're kept, how they're kept, they could still get loose theoretically, and we'd have to be able to deal with that. Correct?
Ideally, yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Cox, you have a question?
Thank you very much.
Well, it's more of a comment. I mean, I think the registering and grandfathering approach seems reasonable in my view. I mean, if we think it's onerous for staff to have to register animals, I think it'll be a lot more onerous for staff to have to go out there and confiscate animals from people. And so I think registering and grandfathering is certainly a reasonable and tried and true approach, apparently.
Thank you, Councilmember Cox. Ms. Watney, I'd have one clarifying question, and this is just kind of assessing risk. You said 18 people have died due to wild exotic, I think, snakes, specifically since 1978. Is that throughout the country, or? Okay.
Yes, and that's large constrictor snakes, boas, pythons, etc. Since 1978, and yes, that's throughout the country.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Watney? All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Phil Goss. Phil is the president of the U.S. Association of Reptile Keepers. So we'll bring Mr. Goss into the meeting.
Hello, is my video going to come on too?
Yeah, so you should you should have a button that allows you to share your video.
Hey, look at that. There it is.
There you go. We see you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Phil Goss. I'm the president of the United States Association of Reptile Keepers, or USARK. We are a 501c6 IRS registered nonprofit in the U.S. And I always point this out. We represent responsible reptile and amphibian keepers. And as someone mentioned earlier, there are quite a few people who keep reptiles as pets. Statistically, there are actually 25,000 people just in Raleigh that have pet reptiles. But again, you have to realize what that means. That's all reptiles. That may be, a child's pet leopard gecko or small corn snake or even small python species. And also, just to highlight on pythons, you can compare them easily to dogs. There are Chihuahua-sized pythons and there are St. Bernard-sized pythons. So you really have to understand that. A lot of times boas and pythons just get thrown in. A lot of people think they're big snakes, but some boas only weigh a few ounces. Again, that's ounces, not pounds as adults. And some pythons don't even get 3 feet long. So, it's important to realize that you're talking about some species that stay very small. And the ball python, for example, is typically a 3 to 3.5 foot long snake sold at every major pet store across the country, including Petco and PetSmart. They don't even have the capacity to get, 15 or 20 feet that a lot of people fear when they hear the word python. So important to put that in perspective. And I would also like to say, I think there was a little bit of misrepresentation, unfortunately, in the HSUS video. Someone who's been keeping large constrictor snakes for over 25 years now in large cages. And, when you see those smaller cages represented or shown, it's really important to put that in perspective too, because a lot of times that's for baby reptiles. Obviously, if you're raising chickens or puppies or horses, whatever they are, you don't let the babies just run around a huge pasture, because it's going to be easy for them to get lost. It's going to be hard for them to find food. It might be hard for them to find a proper heat source. So obviously, if you have baby geckos or frogs or snakes, whatever they are, a smaller enclosure is actually better for animal welfare, because they're going to be able to get access to food and water easier, the appropriate heat. They're going to be able to thermal regulate better than if you have them in too big of an enclosure. So again, unfortunately, sometimes us reptile people get a bad name when those pictures get shown and it's not actually described what's going on with that. And also some of those smaller enclosures are for smaller species of animals. And one of the last things I'd like to highlight, I didn't prepare a presentation because I knew we were limited on time, but a lot of times we get labeled as peddlers and told these animals are easier to keep. I'm not going to say that some reptile seller may not do that. It's no different than a used car salesman who may fib to you about a car, but our association and the majority of reptile keepers and breeders are not like that. We're not telling people that large constrictors and snakes are suitable first pets. Actually, USARK goes out of the way to tell people and actually advise sellers to provide what we call reptile acquisition forms, so that people realize how big a species may get or that it may not be an appropriate first pet. So again, there is a lot of separation between, again, the majority of reptile keepers are responsible. Again, with 5 million households in the U.S. keeping these animals, if the majority were irresponsible, you can only imagine that would be all that was in the news was some escaped reptile. So again, I just wanted to kind of clarify on some of that stuff. And the last clarification is going to be on the large snake deaths. Certainly, there is a risk that comes with certain species of snakes, but again, to just look at the 5,000 foot view on that, some of those incidents, well, actually every one could have been prevented. One incident, for example, was a large 13-foot python that the owner was trying to give a shot to by herself. Obviously, if she would have had a person or two assisting her, that would have avoided that incident. No different than someone administering medicine to a horse. Obviously, you may not do that on your own. It's going to be much more advisable to have 2 or 3 people there to assist with that. So, sometimes working with these large animals, it was because someone did something he or she should not have been doing. And again, that's why the incident occurred. And I would much rather spend my time answering questions than throwing out facts and statistics at you. So I'll be here for the whole call. If you want to come back to me, I'll be more than happy to answer questions. I have written over 100 ordinances and regulations at city and state levels. I actually worked on the Arlington, Virginia ordinance. I was a consultant on that and wrote much of that ordinance, which I know was mentioned earlier. So again, I'm here to answer questions and help Raleigh any way I can going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goss. Do any council members have any questions? Councilmember Knight?
Thank you, Mr. Goss. You and I have had some good conversations. I appreciate you being on to present reasonable and ethical reptile and amphibian keepers. Do you agree that it is rational?
Councilmember Knight, you're breaking up real bad.
Snakes from the
Councilmember, given the poor connection,
of
we're happy to
terms of
read your questions from chat
safety
if
factor.
it's.
But no.
I don't think we've caught up yet. Councilmember Knight, you have a really weak connection. Do you want to send us the question via chat and then we'll read it?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other council members have questions for Mr. Goss? Councilmember Cox.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I appreciate Mr. Goss's comments, and I would certainly welcome his input into any ordinance that we draft, and I would look forward to him actually being a resource for that.
Gladly.
This is where I make fun of Councilmember Knight's age and how slowly he types. I know Councilmember Cox has got to have a higher words per minute.
And we can always come back if we want to go to the next panelist. And I can hop back on. I'll be here.
Thank you, Mr. Goss.
I'm done.
Yep.
I think we
I'm
made.
done. Hang on. Well, I'm done. I'm done.
Oh, there it is. All right. Here is not my words, Councilmember Knight's question. Don't you agree it is reasonable and rational to delineate venomous snakes from the rest of the reptiles in terms of risk factor and public safety factor?
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. You know, venomous snakes and crocodilians need to be treated a little bit differently. I wouldn't label them as inherently dangerous, again, because, you know, unfortunately with venomous reptiles, a lot of people think they go out looking to bite people. That's actually the last thing they want to do. Any venomous snake, actually the last thing it will do is bite a person. That's only if it's cornered or feels threatened, because their venom, it's hard to produce, and they will only bite, again, as a, you know, last ditch effort to save themselves. That's intended for their prey and not to defend themselves. So, but still, certainly, you know, when you have a situation like you just had in Raleigh, you've got to do something, and I understand that. But, you know, I compare it to, you know, owning a horse or a German Shepherd or a gun. You know, if someone's going to be responsible and keep that animal in an escape-proof enclosure, it's going to be absolutely no risk to the general public. And, you know, certainly irresponsible people should be punished, like the gentleman we just had who let the cobra get loose. And again, having 75 venomous snakes is not something that's common. I don't know why he had that many reptiles when he wasn't doing some type of bona fide, you know, either educational or research program with that, or possibly going into, you know, milking the snakes for venom to produce anti-venom. But again, that was just a, you know, unfortunate situation, possibly even like animal hoarding situations that you may have seen before in Raleigh. And, you know, it's unfortunate. I understand you got to do something. So certainly there should be a different level of discussion on those animals. But again, we just really hate to see bans if someone's going to be responsible. I hate to see the government come in and say that you can't do this when you have the resources and capacity to do something responsibly. But again, the city may need to look at why you're keeping those animals. And if it's not for, you know, college coursework or some type of bona fide program, there should be at least some type of permit that somebody could get if they were going to be responsible with those animals in the city. Oh, and sorry, I see a question about snakes escaping their enclosures. You know, again, it's you can compare it on so many things. You can compare it with dog owners or horse owners. Sometimes those animals get loose. It happens on occasion. But again, just think about, as I told you, there are statistically 5% of the U.S. has pet reptiles. So in Raleigh, which is almost 500,000 people, you're looking at 25,000 people who have pet reptiles. If these snakes and other reptiles were constantly escaping, they would be all over Raleigh. So it's not that common at all. Again, I've been keeping them breeding since 1997 and keeping large snakes longer than that. And I've never had a snake get loose. So we're talking 30 years. At one point, I had almost 80 large constrictors. because I was a breeder. But again, never had one get loose. So it happens, but it's not that common.
Councilmember Fort.
Yes, I was going to say we've got a couple questions in the chat even before Councilor Knight's questions. I'm not sure how we're relaying those questions and making sure the public who may be tuning into this can see the questions and having somebody.
Yeah, I'll address the anti-venom one real quick. And Jen Davis, who I believe is a panelist, she can go in more in depth on this. She's speaking next, but that's something else the city may want to look at. They may require that some anti-venom be kept at the local hospital that is funded by any venomous keepers in Raleigh. That's something else that we've seen put in place in ordinances in other places. So, but again, I think Jen can speak on that at a higher level than I can. So.
Great, thank you. I think that'll do it then, Mr. Goss, for now. And then we have one final panelist.
So our last panelist is Jen Davis. Jen is the Director of Code Venom Trauma Solutions, and she's also a North Carolina Association of Reptile Keepers board member. Jen will be joining us.
Hi there, how are you guys today? Can you hear me?
Yes,
We can
ma'am.
hear you, and we can see you now too. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm a little bit illiterate when it comes to technology at times. So, does anybody have any questions to start? Phil covered a lot of what I was going to say, which thank you, Phil, and so did Brad. Are there any questions that I can answer very quickly? None? Go ahead, Councilmember Knight.
Yeah.
Hey, Ms. Davis, good to talk to you again. I guess you cover, Mr. Goss is dealing with reptiles and amphibians. You deal with animals beyond reptile and amphibians. That's correct. Isn't that correct?
I serve as a consultant for just about everything exotic, and I've got extensive with indigenous wildlife as well. I work with federal, state, and local municipalities on a regular basis.
Okay, great.
These
Thank you.
animals.
So I think part of what you could enlighten us is about maybe the non-reptiles and amphibians that Mr. Goss did not speak to. You know, big cats, primates, and those type of things that maybe you could sort of give us some advice of how to deal with those. Thank you.
Okay. So I've been dealing with this for 3 decades, about 30 years. I grew up in this type of industry. I've, been in and out of zoos and worked in and out of zoos in different capacities. Over the past 10 years, we have seen a pretty good decline in ownership, private ownership here in North Carolina of large cats, exotic cats, anything from a serval and above. I certainly wouldn't consider a serval or an ocelot a large cat, but it's definitely not a house cat. Primates, I have seen a decline in some of the larger old world primates. Some of the smaller species that people see glorified on social media, in movies, things like that, there has been a small uptick in those with like your small marmosets, finger monkeys, spider monkeys, capuchins, things like that. My issues with some of these is, unfortunately, there are people that will find a way to obtain anything. It doesn't matter what it is. And they think that it's an inherent right that they can have that, whether they're able to care for it properly or not. But as a whole, I would say 90% do actually take care of these animals and provide the environments and the enrichment that they need. They seek veterinary care. A lot of these owners have college funds set up for these animals so that they can maintain the care for them. I do believe that there needs to be a permitting registration type system for all exotic animals that could be considered inherently dangerous, which is another word that I don't like. Anything can be considered inherently dangerous. We've certainly had our fair share of dog attacks this year. Feral cats, decimate wildlife populations, have pushed wildlife populations, certain species to extinction. There are lots of issues that can be talked about and discussed when it comes to complications. A permitting system, I've heard a lot today about permitting systems being comprehensive and not able to be really not feasible and hard to maintain, but they're actually not. If you get your ordinance and you set your definitions and you make clear defined definitions with very clear defined penalties for breaking these conditions, for violating these conditions, the monies that actually come in from the registrations or the permitting processes can actually help pay and defer some of those costs that are in there. It is something that can happen. I've worked with many agencies, many different counties and states on working with these ordinances, just like Phil has. So it is something to be brought into discussion. One of my biggest fears is that if a ban goes across or a prohibition goes across, even with a grandfathering clause, how are you going to deal with these animals? What agency is going to come in and take these animals? Who is going to care for these animals? Your animal control agencies, I'll be honest with you, most animal control agencies across the state, unless I've been the one to train them, have no clue how to deal with these. And that's what I've done. I volunteer train these agencies for free out of my own pocket so that these guys and first responders aren't going to places where they're going to be put in dangerous situations and not know what to do with them. So there has to be something put into place. If you're going to push forth an ordinance, regardless of whether there's a ban or whatever have you, you need to think about your officers, not just animal control officers, all of your first responders and your officers that would be engaging these homes or these places, these farms where these animals are found, so that they properly know how to take care of themselves. And we need to look out for the welfare of these animals as well. It's not the animal's fault that they're being kept in captivity. So ownership, a keeper, culpability needs to lie with them, making sure that they have everything. And that's as much as going forth and introducing yourself. So with a registration or a permitting system, these animals, these places where these animals are found can be kept in a CAD system. It doesn't need to be opened up to where the public knows, what's going on and who's got what in their house. But for our officers, our LEO, firemen, EMS services, animal control officers, public officials, if they have to make a visit to this home or this area, that they know exactly what's in the home. And if they need backup, they know exactly what. So if a 911 call is made, those operators are very, very skilled at going down and picking which buttons and who needs to be sent for backup and who needs to call. And that line of communication goes out for those resources, those additional resources that are needed.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Do council members have any questions? We're about questions out, unless that's Councilmember Cox. I feel like you're queuing up there.
I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate these insights and comments.
Councilmember Knight, did you have a question?
Nicole.
Ma'am.
I do have to say, most of the exotic animal keepers, especially our reptile keepers here in the state, they're not opposed to a registration system. They're not opposed to, something that is feasible and obtainable. They're not opposed to being inspected. They really want to do the right thing by their animals. I just think that banning these animals because the general public is ill-educated and scared of these animals. I don't see where that's going to be a solution to this issue. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Councilmember Knight sent us a question in the chat. Do permitting systems you've dealt with have to pay for a permit?
Yes. Yes, permits and registration fees can be done. It's no different than the counties and the municipalities that have a registration system for their dogs and cats. Theirs typically get attached with their taxes, or they get attached to their rabies vaccinations. You can make it where it is a blanket fee of $25 for, let's say, a tier of if you have 20 or less animals. You can make it a different type of registration fee or permitting fee for those that have something that would be considered more dangerous, like venomous. You could make it a, $2 to $5 or whatever have you. You could make it an amount that's, like I said, feasible and obtainable for responsible owners per animal instead of a blanket. There are many different options that can be there, but the monies that can come in from this basically can go into an escrow type of account where if there are any issues, it doesn't come out of the taxpayer's dollar to take care of it. It would come out of the actual owners themselves, the people who are keeping. It's kind of like a liability or an insurance policy where there is an amount of money that's in there. So anti-venom to local facilities in case of a bite. So when we're talking about anti-venom or antivenin, the terms are used interchangeably. These owners are capable of obtaining a BBIND, which is a federal investigational drug license, to where that they can purchase and have their own antivenin in their own homes for the species that they have. So there's an ability for them to do so without it being kept at the local facilities. One of the problems with some of the antivenins is they can expire. They do expire. So using them past an expiry, typically the hospitals will not use anything outside of expiry unless it is an absolute emergent situation, or there is a protocol that's in place by that individual keeper that states, if the only antivenin available for me is expired, I hold so-and-so not liable. They can use the expired antivenin on me. These are drugs, and some of them can be quite costly. They can cost as little as $40 a vial, and they can cost up to, dear God, some of the hospitals mark them up to $50,000 a vial. So, but they can buy it on their own with that BBIND, which is very easy, very simple to obtain. And I'm more than happy to send that information to you guys about that as well. The only thing that they require to do that is they have to have a doctor that will sign off for them and a place to store the antivenin. It has to be stored properly or it's not efficacious. You can't use it. So instead of the hospitals, covering that cost, or any of our private facilities or zoos, which the antivenin index is what poison control calls to find out where the nearest available antivenin is. So Riverbank Zoo has provided quite a bit for bites that have been in the Southeast. Kentucky Reptile Zoo has provided, Alligator Adventure has provided in the past. They also have the option to say no, that they don't have enough to send out, because it does put their own keepers in danger if they extend that. And recently it was hard to obtain new antivenin because, well, some of the companies were not able to produce it because we were dealing with the COVID issues. So, there are mitigating factors that go into that. However, it could be a requirement that if you are going to possess venomous, that you would have your own BBIND and your own personal store of antivenin. That would also show responsibility and wanting to protect and take care of and promote what we all promote for USARC and NCARC. We want responsible ownership, responsible keepership. A lot of these animals are kept for, stewardship purposes. So, conservation, there are a lot of issues that are in there. And some people have reptiles for pets because, well, they're hypoallergenic. So, some people can't have fluffy cats and dogs and bunnies because dander doesn't work well for them.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. We're going to get ready to move to public comment because I'm keeping an eye on our time, and we have at least, I think.
Sorry about that.
No. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate your service to helping us in the past, and I appreciate all of y'all who've come out and spoke today. I think we have Mr. Boggs is going to help us with our public comment section. And I will, let him read off our speakers and get them queued up in the order you have them, Mr. Boggs.
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm just searching for.
And as we get ready for that, we're going to give speakers 3 minutes each. You do not have to take the full 3 minutes if you don't want to. Ms. Hayward, do we have a clock up, or I can keep time here.
I believe Colin is going to monitor time for us. Colin, will you confirm that?
Yes, I can monitor time for us. We actually don't have anyone specifically indicated if they would like to speak, but if folks can just send me a chat in the chat box and privately, and just let me know if you would like to speak, we can
So,
add it.
Colin, let's just go down the list of registered individuals. So you can do that either in the order that they came through or on the basis of their registration. So I think by virtue of the registration, I think they're indicating their interest in speaking. So they can certainly decline if they believe that their issues have already been adequately addressed.
Okay, the first one we have up then is Laura Combs.
Oh, hello. Thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you for taking this topic up. I'm going to go quickly, so hold on. My name's Laura Combs, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a master's in urban and regional planning with a specialty in environmental planning. I was a state of Florida employee for the Florida Department of Natural Resources, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and with nonprofits from 1990 to 2006. My first point, and I wasn't here today to speak about reptiles, but I urge you to consult with local governments in the state of Florida regarding how they handle regulation of released reptile species. I'm still in contact with my colleagues, and as you know, in Florida, reptiles have been released willy-nilly. In North Carolina, they cannot survive the cold temperatures here, but I can't imagine that North Carolinians behave so much better than all the folks in Florida who have released reptiles that have wreaked havoc on the ecosystem. Second, I came today to ask you to think bigger and to tag on to what HSUS provided in their testimony. There are cases where traveling shows come through local government jurisdictions. They may have a car breakdown, for example, or a truck breakdown. Those animals are now stranded. The exhibitor will open them up to public interaction. I'm encouraging you to check into Nevada's new law where they have no public contact restrictions on big cats, elephants, primates, wolves, bears, hyenas. We had a case here in North Carolina, Nosy the elephant, and she her last performance was in Raleigh, and fortunately, her circus broke down in Alabama. Local government had just busted an exotic animal ring. They knew what they were looking at. They confiscated Nosy. She eventually was retired to sanctuary at the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary after many horrendous years of travel and abuse. And she does carry TB antibodies. So some of these animals, like elephants, can interact with humans and transmit that disease. So banning the interaction with wild and exotic performing animals would be great help to deter future visits of these types of organizations. And, you know, in North Carolina, we do have bans, Orange County bans displays of these types of animals. Asheville does have a law on the books as well. We still have circuses coming to Raleigh, and you never know who's going to come with a sideshow. In Florida, we saw them all the time, and I was calling my colleagues as a state employee saying, come check this facility, because the conditions that these animals were kept in were horrendous. So hopefully you can think bigger, look to deter these types of visiting shows by banning public contact with these animals, because it is a public health hazard. And I think that's all I put down in my notes. I'll be happy to connect you with some folks in Florida if you want to hear what other people are doing on these issues. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is that enforcement can be really difficult regarding these types of situations, and following up and ensuring people are adhering to the conditions that they agreed to through permitting. One last thing. Felicia the camel was here in Wake County at the fairgrounds July 18th, 2021. She collapsed. Wake County Animal Control came and investigated. Felicia was terribly abused, had no water. Wake County Animal Control did a great job trying to get to the bottom of it and alerting future jurisdictions. So these large animals, these performing animals, live in horrible conditions, and local governments are key to helping to keep them safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Boggs, you can just keep on rolling through.
Next up, we have Tatiana McDivitt.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Tatiana,
Hello.
are you there?
I can't hear anything. Are you getting me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You hear me?
Yep, you
Okay.
have 3 minutes.
All right. Hello, I just wanted to say that the way in which the law is written right now will hurt species that you don't mean to. Like, I'm talking about macaws and stuff, like animals that aren't going to hurt you at all. Because right now, how it's written, it leaves the law enforcement or whoever's in charge to decide if an animal is wild or dangerous. What one person thinks is wild and dangerous, another may not. Like, some people might think a parrot is dangerous, but other people obviously don't think that. And it's not fair for people to have to guess, like, will the government charge me for this animal? You need to have a clear list of each species, not wild and dangerous, including but not limited to. You need to name the species, not the genus, but the species of whatever species you're putting down. It needs to be crystal clear. I've seen certain laws and certain certain instances where someone lost their lizard and animal control picked it up. Well, they weren't allowed to have their lizard back because they thought it was dangerous, but someone was allowed to take their American alligator home that day. Whatever happens needs to be crystal clear. The species need to be crystal clear exactly what you mean. Also, I have questions as why there are ducks and geese on this list. Ducks and geese are pets, domesticated pets. Food, egg layers, and I don't understand why they're on this law. That's it. Just clarify, make a list of the species with their scientific names, and be exact. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
And next we have Rachel Matthews.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm a captive wildlife attorney at the PETA Foundation. I'll make this quick. I just wanted to emphasize what Ms. Watney said, the points that she made in terms of bans being good policy. In my work as a captive wildlife attorney, I work a lot on getting laws enforced, and I can tell you from experience that permitting systems really fall short when it comes to getting these laws enforced. As Ms. Watney said, Florida has an extensive system, and it also has the worst record of dangerous incidents with wild animals. So thank you for considering this measure, and we encourage you to pass a ban on possession of dangerous wild animals.
Thank you, Ms. Matthews.
Ellen, have we completed those signed up for public comment?
Yeah, I think we have one or two more here. Let me.
Okay.
Next up, we have Callie Gerber.
Hi, my name's Callie Gerber. I'm an attorney, founding attorney with Gerber Animal Law Center. I live in Raleigh. My firm is in Raleigh. I just wanted to join in and listen to what's happening on this bill. And I definitely support the communication that's going on today and the experts who have spoken before you. I'm glad you've all been listening clearly, very attentively. I do support this bill in the way that it will prohibit ownership of the big cats, the lions, the tigers, the bears, the wolves. As a former board of director for Carolina Tiger Rescue, I'm very familiar with some of the problems with captive animals, as HSUS and PETA have also brought to the table today, and look forward to seeing where you go with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gerber.
And that looks like that's everyone.
Great, thank you, Mr. Boggs. Can anyone else see Councilmember Knight? There he is. He keeps going in and out for me, at least. Sorry, Councilmember. So at this point, this really wraps up our conversation for today. It really was kind of a deeper dive and a level set on what all's going out, or what all the ordinances are across city, county, and state, as well as hearing from some experts. But I would welcome any final thoughts or questions from fellow council members. Councilmember Cox.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate my thank you as well to everyone that spoke today. This is actually a pretty complex issue, not cut and dried, and I think we're going to have to take some time to consider what we've heard here in order to really draft a good ordinance.
Thank you, and I agree. There has been some conversation, and we've talked about it, I think, at the table about when we come back in GNR to look at the ordinance and have those conversations about what needs to be in there, going ahead and taking out the piece that's about feeding and just really focusing on the animal piece. And I think there's, after hearing today, there may be some interest in, and I'm looking at Councilmember Knight, given your kind of leadership on this issue, on further focusing it on the type of animal, if we just want to look at herps, or if we want to, I'm hip on the lingo now, or if we want to also still consider large mammals, given the Wake County ordinance. Councilmember Knight, do you have any thoughts or do any council members, or do we want to just kind of bring it back as is?
Yeah, I'm worried that you may not be able to hear me, but if you can, I think legal staff has a lot from, especially Mr. Howard, in terms of limiting our list down to, we can take a lot of things off of it, which is good. Based on what was talked about today. And I would like to come back with a draft ordinance for us to look at next time in a month at the next committee meeting with these ideas. This is something that I have championed. The zebra cobra incident did happen in my district, and there's a lot of concern there. So I'd love to be able to come back with a draft ordinance based on this conversation today and have conversation around with something to talk about. So I'd like to go forward that way if the committee would be supportive of that.
I'm seeing some.
Can I just ask a question real quick? There's two independent regulatory schemes that have been presented, so it would be helpful if we could get direction on what the ordinance would do. Is it a regulation licensing ordinance, or is it a ban ordinance? Because they're totally different. They would be written in totally different ways and have significantly different degree of complexity, I
think. Councilmember Knight and then Councilmember Cox.
Well, I mean, I'll leave it to the committee chair as where do you think we're ready to start? I mean, I guess what our attorney's asking us, how do we want to do it? And I don't think we're there yet. You could come back with draft ordinance language that gives these different options. I obviously have my point of view that you probably understand, but we may not be there in terms of the rest of the committee. So maybe we bring back an option with a ban and a grandfather scheme, what that language looks like based on what other cities have done, or a language with just permitting and what reasonable language will look like to give us options. Or if we're not there yet, we could just discuss it at the next committee and see if we can get a majority to decide how to move forward without.
Can I clarify, Councilmember Knight, to make sure I heard you? Was the suggestion that we find a model ordinance from another municipality, one that includes a ban and a grandfather, and another that's a licensing scheme? Was that what the suggestion was?
Well, I think from the beginning, I've been asking for us to look at what other cities and states have done. We're coming at this late, right? Raleigh's behind the 8 ball on this issue, so we're having to catch up. I think it's reasonable to look at what other cities and states have done and try to draft something that is similar to those. Now, they're not all the same, so there are options within that about how to go forward, and maybe we should lay out those options. Draft language, but but we got to write for Raleigh. So that would give us those options in draft language form to be able to look at, maybe, is what I was thinking.
Councilmember Cox, you had your hand up.
Yes, I think any ordinance is going to have to probably include things like registration and regulation. As far as banning is concerned, I mean, certainly you can include language for that. Haven't made any decisions yet myself about where I am on banning. A lot of that depends on the language of whatever ordinance we're looking at. And I agree with Councilmember Knight that you know, let's take another look at what other municipalities have done on this. And then I would also emphasize that we, you know, whatever we come up with, that we make it freely available to the panelists that we have brought in today, the experts that we have brought in today on both sides, on all sides, in order to get their input as well.
Madam Attorney, I don't know if that answers your question, but it does sound like we're ready to pare down the list, but maybe leave open how we would actually enforce or handle until we have more conversation around that.
I'm not really clear, honestly. So you want me to write an ordinance that regulates and one that bans? Is that what you're saying? You're going to come back and talk about both of them?
I do.
Well,
I think maybe what the question is to excerpt provisions from other ordinances that do that differently, to allow the committee to contrast some of that language. Is that, I think that's what I heard from Councilmember Cox and from Councilmember Knight.
Go ahead, Councilmember Cox.
Okay, I mean, certainly, let's say there's a ban, but there's also grandfathering. You're going to need to be able to regulate whatever is being grandfathered. So I don't see how you can escape regulation if there's going to be grandfathering.
Okay, but that's one ordinance with a ban and a grandfather. So I guess we could outline. I mean, we have looked at every single ordinance in the state of North Carolina and have studied them and know what all of the other jurisdictions do. I think the issue there is that we have not been able to get any information from those jurisdictions about what they're doing on the ground. So, you know, can we beg, borrow, and steal the language? Yes, we can, and we have done that in the past with some drafts, but I don't know that those particular approaches are helpful because they aren't coming from the experts that you're talking about. They're coming from an ordinance that's been on someone's books that apparently they're not enforcing. So we can certainly put something together. I guess it would be easier for us if we knew the general the direction of to go, and if it's ban and grandfather, we can come with that, or if there's a regulation sort of scheme. But I guess we'd have to go to and find some jurisdictions that are actually where it's working and they're using them instead of ones like we found in North Carolina where they've been on the books for years and years and nobody's done anything about it, because that I don't think has been working out very well. So we could start with basically a prohibition with a grandfather scheme and come back with that and take a look at it. And then if you decide you want something else, we can go in another direction. But it might be easier to have a definitive approach to go with to start the drafting process, if that makes sense.
That makes sense to me. I'm wondering if we're there, or do we need more conversation before folks are ready? I'm not in favor of an all-out ban. So I would be interested in this grandfather approach. I think Councilmember Cox is in agreement, and Councilmember Hart, I don't know where you stand on this. You're welcome.
Yeah, I just kind of like to see the language first before I weigh in on it.
Then maybe we can look at some drafts or look at existing ordinances in between this meeting and next meeting. I don't know what to tell you, Madam Attorney. Councilmember.
Yeah, I think the city attorney's office and our office can collaborate to do a bit deeper dive on the benchmarking that you saw today to allow a bit deeper conversation of the options. So is that perhaps an incremental next step to deepen the learning?
Councilmember Cox.
The city attorney has mentioned, you know, there are some communities that have regulations, but they're not being enforced and they're not very effective. So I guess in addition to looking at banning with a grandfather clause, what are examples of regulations, a regulatory approach that is working? Are there examples of that?
In bringing that.
Yeah, and we can certainly continue to reach out to other cities. Again, we did try to reach a number of municipalities in North Carolina to understand their active programming. We had difficulty getting responses. We can certainly redouble those efforts to see if we can get more response. So I don't appreciate the feedback, and we will continue those efforts to see if we can collect additional information. I can't speak to why we're not getting easier responses. We do have anecdotal information that, again, the staffing and proactive work is limited, but we will certainly continue to try to get more information directly from other jurisdictions.
Right. I think it was Phil Goss that said he's been involved in writing ordinances, particularly one in Virginia. So I would encourage you to work with him.
Yes, and so those 5 cities that were referenced, those were cities that were that did provide information and have provided follow-up. So certainly for those 5 cities that proactively responded to our survey already, then we certainly do have information. I think he made reference to Virginia Beach, and we do have contacts in Virginia Beach that we can deepen communication and understand more about their implementation.
Okay.
Councilmember Knight, you've had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I think the staff between the legal staff and Ms. Hayward's staff has done the work on the, I mean, that's done. We got that. It's really now to put the options out there. I think you just need to go, we talked about, there's about 5 options as how we can go forward. We shouldn't, I mean, I can help put those together. It's pretty easy to put together on one piece of paper. Here's the options: ban, straight ban, with grandfather clause. Okay, what's that mean? Registration, permitting. All right, is there cost involved? I mean, I think we just lay out those different layers and options and then let us go from there. I think they're pretty clear. I think we dwindled it down somewhat. I think we've got the list of animals pretty specifically now. The native North Carolinian ones come off of it. The other ones stay on it. And I think we can go forward with that.
And can I say, I think that would be good for us, that we can bring a broad outline of this is what a band would look like, and here are some things you could put in that, and here is the band with a grandfather, and here are these things, and here is a registration, so that, I mean, there has been an ordinance drafted out there, and so it was drafted before everybody knew which direction that they wanted to go. So once you get all the pieces together, I think, and we have the options, then we actually put the whereases together and put those on paper, I think is the better way to go, if that makes sense.
That sounds good. I've learned from Mr. Boggs that we have one more person signed up for public comment who was waiting. I think she was having some connectivity issues. So Mr. Boggs, if we could get her on the line.
Looks like they are no longer available.
Okay, she may have sent me a chat, a message here. Was it Mrs. Price?
Miss Nyreen.
Oh, okay.
This is
Oh,
Karen Irene.
Oh,
There you go.
excellent.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you for this. I just wanted to say I do support this ordinance. Again, my name is Karen Irene in Raleigh, District B. I'm a 10-year animal circus protest coordinator, and I believe this ordinance should also include banning exhibitors. The circus is a prime example, and Raleigh has 3 animal circuses down from 6, which includes and not limited to tigers, lions, monkeys, bears, llamas, camels, zebras, and elephants. On Black Friday, the Raleigh Amran Shriners will host the Royal Hannaford Circus, and they bring all these animals except bears and lions. So that is all I want to say, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Nyreen. All right. I think that's it for public comment as well. And staff, do you feel you have what you need to come back for our next GNR meeting? We'll keep this item in committee.
Yep, thank you. I believe, I think there's good direction. I do want to flag for the public, the next regularly scheduled Growth and Natural Resources meeting would fall on November 23rd.
Yep.
So, Chair, you may want to discuss with your counterparts that is the week of Thanksgiving. So the committee, I just want to give notice to the listening, those tuning in, that there is the possibility the meeting timing might be amended due to the holiday through a special meeting. So I imagine you would make that announcement at your meeting on November 2nd. So just wanted to give that heads up to those listening.
That's right. Thank you. And to our city clerk, do we have what we need to keep this item in committee? We all good? Thank you, Ralph. All right.
If I may, Madam Chairman, forgive me, you don't need to have any motion or anything else. It's just held in committee.
Thank you. All right. Unless there's any further questions or comments from council members, we will adjourn. Thank y'all very much.